Welcome everyone. This is the third in our series of spring talks at the lay community of St Benedict. So it's great to see everyone, and a special welcome to Bishop Nick, who's going to talk tonight. I'm Catherine, this is Peter. We're members of the community, for people who aren't members of the community, and we're also the conveners of the Lay Community Caring for Creation group. So the Caring for Creation group was set up in the community after COP26. And the idea is that we promote prayer and reflection and action in response to the climate and ecological crises. So our most recent initiative was in Advent, when we promoted Bishop Nick's book, Sleeper's Wake. And that's a series of daily reflections on the climate crisis for Advent. So it seems very appropriate just at this moment, when we're at the start of Lent, to come back to that book, because we're again in a time of reflection. So it's great to have Bishop Nick to remind us of some of those things this evening. And while I'm talking about Lent, I would just like to mention our Lenten calendar, which I think probably people may well have found. It's on the Lay Community website under events. And that's a series of short daily reflections, just about 50 words, contributed by lots of different people in the community, and thinking about our response to God's call to care for his world. And I would like to invite everyone who wants to contribute reflections of their own. They might have been reading Sleeper's Wake, something else may just occur to them. So if you've got a short reflection, you can contribute to it. You go to the page on the website and there's a button to press, and that will tell you what to do.
So I'm just going to say a few words now to introduce Bishop Nick to us. So he trained for ordination at King's College in London and at Westcott House in Cambridge. And he was in ministry in the East End of London and taught ethics and mission at the Lincoln Theological College before becoming the vicar of St Martin in the Fields in Trafalgar Square. He was consecrated Bishop of Salisbury in 2011 and served in that capacity until 2021. And he was the Church of England's lead bishop on the environment, chairing the Environment Working Group in the Church of England from 2014 to 2021. He's the author of 3 books, of which Sleeper's Wake is the most recent. The book challenged and inspired many of us during Advent, opening our eyes to the reality of the crisis that we face. Bishop Nick, we're delighted that you're here tonight, and we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say to us.
Thanks very much for inviting me. And I'm pleased to discover that there's a lay community of St Benedict, and that my neighbour, Father Aidan, is the chaplain, and there's a connection with Worth, because 3 of the brothers live in the parish. Actually, I think 4 of them live in the parish here in Kemp Town. So I'm glad to be with you, and I'm really pleased that you've got a Care for Creation group, because that does seem to me to be the key to every group finding a way of acting in this crisis, that there are people who champion it and help it to become a more general concern. But every parish, every group needs somebody in some small group to make this work for everybody. So I'm really grateful. You're very well structured from my point of view from the off. When I was ordained as a deacon and then priest a long time ago now, back in 1979 and 80, I was working in Stepney, and the first confirmation group that I had was a group of kids who, they weren't very good at reading and writing. And I was challenged by this. I bought them some comic books and to tell Bible stories, you know, Moses, Desert Commander, and that sort of, and actually that didn't quite do it. But we worshipped in a medieval church, and they didn't seem to take amiss with that. And I hit on the idea of taking them to the National Gallery to go and look at 2 pictures of the Nativity as a way of getting them to engage with the scriptures, which were simply too intimidating in a written form. And what I discovered was that we're much more visual and much more able to enter into the narrative and actually into the gospel through pictures, which of course is the tradition out of all of these paintings come. And that got me engaged with using pictures as a way of communicating the gospel. And then when I found myself as a parish priest living opposite the National Gallery, well, that was a bit of a gift. And that's where the art of worship came from, by doing things with their education department, particularly in Lent and a little bit in Advent, but mainly in Lent. Doing gallery talks with one of their staff who knew about the painting, and I knew a bit about the scriptures, and we'd stitch the conversation together. So when I was coming up to retirement as Bishop of Salisbury, the Archbishop of York said, look, would you write the Advent book for 2022, but use pictures in it, because I've really enjoyed that when you've done it before. And I want you to distill all that you've learned as the lead bishop on the environment, which was an extraordinarily difficult thing for him to challenge me to do, because I don't think I've got a very simple distillation. But actually writing Sleepers Wake did help me with that. I'm slightly challenged by you having read the book, or most of you having read the book. I think it probably will work for those who are using it in Lent. It is tied to Advent in a very specific kind of way. But I hope that it will work well for those who are coming to do it. I'm going to share my screen, because I thought the easiest way to do it, I've only got one painting, I think, but I've got quite a lot of images just to work through. And I'll speak for about probably 15 minutes, and then we'll open up to a discussion. So I think this is the image that most changed our view of the world in which we live. It's a photograph taken on Christmas Eve in 1968 from the moon, and it shows this fragile blue planet that David Attenborough has in a way helped us appreciate so much. But it is so unlike anything else we can see in space. And we have much more of a sense of we're in this together, this small blue fragile planet Earth, which is also very resilient and which seems to be tolerant and creative and life-giving. And it's extraordinary to see it from the moon. 50 years after taking the picture, William Anders, the astronaut who took the picture, said, "We set out to explore the moon and instead discovered the Earth." And that, I think, is so far the great achievement of our space exploration, that we see ourselves quite differently. And as in the pandemic, people use the language of "we're in this together." Oh, now I'm challenged because I don't know how to, it's not moving on in the way that it would normally. That's it. So if you've read the book, you'll realize that I began with the book's fundamental perception really is that of an American who was dean of a school, forestry and something or other at Yale University, called Gus Speth. And Gus said about 5 years ago, "I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. But and that 30 years of good science could fix that. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, apathy, and greed, and we scientists don't know how to deal with that." And it seems to me, and I think it seems to quite a lot of people who are alert to faith and working with climate change, that this is as much a spiritual problem as it is a technical problem. And those issues of selfishness, apathy, and greed aren't new issues. They're issues that we have been dealing with for the whole of human history. And I thought this painting by Rembrandt of Belshazzar's Feast was a great place to start, because here we are. Jerusalem has been destroyed in 587. The Jews have been taken into exile in Babylon. And here we are at a feast which is just the pits. King Belshazzar is using the sacred vessels from the temple in Jerusalem, wine, women, and song. And then a hand writes on the wall behind him, and they cannot understand what is written, and they're frightened. And the whole thing comes as a sort of huge shock. It becomes an archetypal story for Jews and indeed for Christians, because it's a story which probably gained the form that we know it in the 2nd century, after the second destruction of the temple, in the events that Jews remember nowadays in Hanukkah, which coincides rather nicely with Advent most years, and did this last year. And King Belshazzar's wife is the person who identified Daniel among the exiles as the person who could identify the run on the wall. And it seemed to me a great image for the difficulties that we have now. And scientists, when I became the Church of England's lead bishop on the environment, quite a few people asked to come and see me because they said, actually, we're really struggling with this. The science has been clear for over 30 years, but policymakers aren't moving fast enough. They're not really getting it. And we think that the church is both an organized community that has some potential to work in a way that helps civil society, but we also think this is a matter of faith, and therefore they were really very helpful in helping me to understand what the task might be in terms of how to use the role that I've been given on behalf of the church. I love these climate strikes because the climate science is very complex, and those of us who aren't scientists find it pretty difficult to understand. But there's a guy called Ed Hawkins at Reading University who developed these climate stripes as a way of trying to show in a graphic form, in a simple way, a bit like I was with the kids in Stepney, using a visual image to help us understand the seriousness of what we're in. He took each stripe is a year of average temperature at Reading since 1850, and this is through to 2020. And what it shows is the blue is cold, the red is hotter, and the hottest has been in the most recent years. I've now forgotten, but it's in the book, I think, that is it the hottest 12 years have been this century? And what it's showing is a temperature rise of just over 1 degree C in Reading. And that's a pretty typical pattern across the Earth as an average global warming. And I think for most of us, 1 degree C doesn't sound very much. But what we all need to realize is the Paris Agreement in 2015 committed the world to, well, committed to no more than 2 degrees C rise above pre-industrial averages. But it said that 1.5 degrees would be much more preferable. And particularly if you live on a Pacific island, 1.5 degrees C is a great deal more preferable, because what's coming alongside this is increase in sea level rise, and at the poles, the melting of ice is such that, you know, we could easily get to a tipping point where a lot of ice melts and sea level rises much faster and dramatically. So there are quite big changes that go along with quite small temperature rises. And we've been watching this, and I think now can see that it's pretty evident from our own experience that we're experiencing more extreme weather events and are struggling much more visibly with climate change. Greta Thunberg and the activists say that what the politicians are doing is blah, blah, blah. And they don't believe that they're taking it seriously enough. And I don't think she's wrong. The politicians are making enormous progress because the COP process is delivering a reduction in the expected increase in temperature. But we're still way above 2 degrees, even after Sharm el-Sheikh. And this, of course, has to be delivered by action. So what Greta Thunberg said is that what we need is cathedral thinking. I really love that, because I think what she meant, but it's a sort of nice image, is that you have to start making the changes without knowing exactly how the building is going to turn out. St. Francis, well, you're Benedictines, but this is all pretty obvious. Great patron saint of the environment. I'm not going to spend long here, but I think that Pope Francis taking the name Francis was a very clear commitment at the outset that he was going to develop the environment as a great theme. Laudato Si is, I think, the most significant church document that's been produced in our lifetime on the environment. And I imagine as Roman Catholics, you're pretty well aware of it. One of the things that Pope Francis said, actually it was about, I think 2019, is that we'll get through the pandemic by looking after one another. It was sort of love your neighbour and take care for the people who are left out. And we'll get through the climate crisis by meditation. And by meditating on something beautiful, which helps us to realize that we can't just use this earth instrumentally as something for us to consume, but actually it's something for us to enjoy and delight in, and therefore take care of. So I put in the book something, I think this is one of the most exquisite works of art that I know. It's much better in reality than it is in picture. It didn't help that in the book it was published side on, but I don't think that matters really. It's tapestry made, designed by Gerhard Richter, who is pretty elderly now, but is probably the almost European artist, contemporary artist that we've got. And Richter, he describes himself as he an agnostic, or he describes himself as an atheist with leanings towards Catholicism. I think that's not uncommon in our society. And he had a son who sang in the cathedral choir in Cologne. And there's, I think, a fantastic stained glass window of his in Cologne Cathedral, which the Archbishop took against. And I quite like that because it sort of shows that even archbishops aren't the curators of the space, that somehow they're public spaces that we're working in, and where there's a story to be worked on and worked out, and art to do. And this tapestry was something new for Richter, and he made a limited number of them, in the same way that he produces paintings, really by dividing a piece of paper into four and squeezing paint going on. You get these wonderful mirror images, but of course, in the context of a chapel, well, what can you see? And I think it's pretty strikingly a cross. And so this incredibly exquisite work of art gets us into the Christian narrative in the context in which this is set. And I, in the book, went back to Mother Julian of Norwich. That God loves us. God made us. God looks after us, and God loves us. I was Bishop of Salisbury, and this is the font in Salisbury Cathedral. You enter church via baptism and the font, and therefore this font by Bill Pye is a sort of lovely way. It's a huge flowing work of art. Actually, in this picture, you can see clearly a cross with water flowing from the edges. And there at the east window, Gabriel Loire's Prisoners of Conscience window, I think from the 1980s, and terribly dark to see. But what it's connecting is the passion of Christ and the lived experience of those prisoners of conscience that, say, Amnesty International or other organisations draw attention to in our world, and making a connection between the passion narrative. Put those two images together, you enter by the font and you're looking towards this east window, and what you get is the Isaiah agenda that Jesus spoke from the prophet Isaiah in the synagogue in Nazareth. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has brought me to proclaim good news to the poor, sight to the blind, to freedom to the prisoner, and so on. And there's a real great sense of what it is to join in this kingdom of God. And here, outside Salisbury Cathedral, and a statue by Elizabeth Frink, with Mary, the mother of Christ, the walking Madonna, not walking to the cathedral, of which she's the patron saint, but walking away from it and into the city, into the town. And that sense in which the task of the Christian life through baptism is to engage with the Isaiah agenda and to walk into the world, to share in the work that God has begun. I think the climate crisis is pretty daunting, and there's a great deal of what's called climate anxiety around. And when you stop to think about it, it's quite easy to be paralysed by the scale of what's about. And I do think that's quite a big issue in our day. It all looks too big. What can I do? I can do nothing really that's very significant. And therefore, it seems to me, and again, one of the main themes in the book in the last week is that if you do one thing that is an act of hope and in a sense an act of rebellion or an act of resilience, then you're likely to do more than one thing. Find one thing and you'll find more. And my wife is descended from Martin Luther, and Luther said that if he knew that the world was going to come to an end tomorrow, he would still plant an apple tree. And that seems to me it's such a hopeful thing to do. There's a guy who lives just up the hill from here, who's part of the church I go to at St George's in Kemp Town. And Alan has planted 485 trees on the estate where he lives. I've forgotten how many are apple trees, but it's close to 100, I think. And this looks like a pear tree to me, but I'm honestly not sure. We went collecting apples last autumn and then turned them into food for all sorts of people. And I just think it's quite a clever and hopeful act. And of course, he's the sort of community activist who's not just doing one thing, but he's doing loads of things, actually. And I think one thing gets us into all sorts of things. So, just to come back and to wrap up, I think the climate crisis, I think Gus Speth was right to say that the environmental problems, biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse and climate crisis are the big issues that face us. They are existential. This blue planet is one on which we have got to act together. Politically, that is enormously difficult. The United Nations is the best thing to pull us together, but it's under great strain. And of course, what's happening in Russia and Ukraine is putting even bigger strains on our capacity to act together quickly. I mean, at a rate which is faster than we've ever had to do, really, and being driven by our use of things rather than the technological change being there. We've got to make these changes really fast, and have set ourselves the target of getting to net zero, being carbon neutral by 2050. That has an enormous technical challenge. But really what I'm saying in the book is, and it's a massive spiritual one too, because it's got to change the way in which we live and the way in which our beliefs and values informs what we do. Now I think we can open it up, and we've got a bit of time for discussion.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Bishop Nick, for those words. And I'm looking at my screen now. I'm looking to see those hands being raised for people who want to contribute. And perhaps while that is happening, I was struck by those words which you mentioned as well. The environmental scientist who came to see the crisis of one of selfishness, apathy, and greed. And I was particularly struck when you were speaking with the image of the Mother of Christ walking away from the cathedral and into the world. And the suggestion that we can all create acts of hope, we can all undertake acts of hope that maybe start to prevent or to diminish this terrible paralysis due to people's wishing to avoid the scale of what is happening. And I wondered if you might say a little bit more about those acts of hope.
Well, thank you. The best thing about having written this book is the number of people that I've spoken to in the last couple of months who've said that they'd read the book and they were going to do this differently. And some of them were quite small and I think quite obvious. And some of them were actually major changes to the way they were organising their life, and quite costly things to do in terms of the impact on their lives or the way they were choosing to spend their money. And in the book, there are simple things like the diet and what we eat. Actually, I mean, it's quite well evidenced that if we were to eat less red meat, we will reduce the carbon footprint considerably. You don't have to eat none. One of the lovely things about being in Salisbury, so there were various people who lived there, including the president of the National Farmers Union, Minette Batters, who was a tenant farmer just outside Salisbury. And she said to me once, she said, well, I think we have all got to eat a bit there. We've got to eat less red meat. I mean, probably don't eat beef more than twice a week. And I don't think I eat beef more than a few times a year, really. We've all got different entry points on this, but we can change our diet and eat a more plant-based diet. That's quite a significant and simple thing to do. I don't know how often you travel by air, but Tear Fund had a campaign a few years ago, the Christian Development Charity, and they were encouraging us to fly less often. That's a bit of a feeble target, because what does it mean? There have been stages of my life where, because of my work, I flew quite often, but I don't now, and I don't need to. And I haven't flown for 3 years. Well, that was partly because of the pandemic. It's a bit circumstantial. We all enjoyed that silence and the fresh air and the impact of the pandemic on the quality of our environment. But actually, we've got to make a similar level of change every year for 10 years if we're going to meet the targets to get to net zero by 2050. The scale of this is really big. Now they can be personal choices that we're making, and I don't think it really helps to set down a standard for all, because our circumstances are different, our entry point is different. But there are lots of things that we can do where individually we'll make changes that affect us, and collectively we will make an impact on our carbon footprint. But what we also need is public policy that frames us. And that's a really difficult bit, but we've got to help our politicians to do it, because they won't just do it of their own will. And to that extent, what part of the public discussion I think at the moment needs to be about how do we engage with that, and what's the role of protest, as well as what's the point of constructive engagement.
Yeah. I can see one hand raised, which is Adam, but I would like to see more. Adam, what would you like to contribute?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Bishop Nick, for that talk, and also for the book and the way that you presented it to us. I'd just like to build on what you were saying there about what we eat in our diet. There was something in the tablet this week where it was said that if all of the Church of England's regular worshippers cut out meat every Friday, 40,000 less tons of CO2 would be emitted. So it was quite an arresting statistic and thought. So I was just wondering, is there room, do you think, for churches to give stronger guidance to people, to their members, to sort of take a lead and to do things like that?
Well, the Roman Catholic Church has, hasn't it? Because I think there has been very specific guidance about Fridays and that recovery of don't eat meat on Fridays, and that's a really good part of your tradition. And the Church of England isn't terribly good about some things of laying down the rules or whatever, and people will make their own decisions. But I'm really struck by the way in which young people are engaging with this, and schools are absolutely on it. And I think there's all the potential in the world to get schools as part of the education of a community, not just of the kids who are part of the school, to think about what we eat and how we eat. And all of the discussion at the moment about food and the shortage of food for some parts of the community, and the way in which we've got opportunities. Actually, a plant-based diet can be a cheaper diet. So there are ways in which we can do this, which are both nourishing and efficient, and making a response to the carbon footprint. So I think there are various ways of doing it, and I think the Roman Catholic Church has got the possibility of meat-free Fridays being part of the tradition. Anglicans are going to find that a bit more difficult, but we're not finding it difficult to say, we've got to change our diet and find ways of doing it. And I actually think there are all sorts of creative things we can do with that, which make quite a big difference. And there is some evidence that we're beginning to move that way. I think 3 or 4 years ago, veganism looked slightly off the wall. Nowadays, it looks pretty mainstream. And there are a much larger number of vegans and an even larger number of vegetarians. And every restaurant has options, and not just one option usually, on the menu. And I think all of that is indicative of the sort of change that you're asking for.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I think you're absolutely right to highlight the place of young people in this, who are generally speaking well ahead of people of my generation. Claire and Charles.
Hello, it's Charles with this point. First of all, Bishop, thank you very much indeed for your talk and the book, which were wonderful, I thought. Just a point of information, although the community's got its roots in the Catholic Church and Worth Abbey, we are very much an ecumenical community as well. And I just thought I ought to draw that to your attention if you weren't already aware of it. We had, some of us, a very interesting Zoom talk by Kathleen McLaughlin, who's head of sustainability at Walmart, just a few days ago. And she was very careful in the approach that she's taking there to avoid sort of being accused of greenwashing. And she made the sort of point that although all these initiatives that they're taking there, which seem very well thought out and valuable, she said only 50% of the people are interested in this. The other 50% are just completely turned off. And I was just wondering whether you've got any sort of suggestions as to how, in our activities and approach to others, we can avoid being counterproductive and turning people off.
Not really. That's a really challenging question. I mean, for me, the question is, how does change happen? And change very rarely happens because absolutely everybody gets it, and there's no controversy about it. And I think I've come to the conclusion that the controversy is quite good for us, that it causes us to think. I find the activities of Just Stop Oil or of Extinction Rebellion quite difficult. They put quite a large number of people off, and sometimes they do things which you feel are counterproductive, like when somebody glued themselves to one of the DLR trains and stopped public transport running and that sort of thing. But they've completely changed the way the debate's heard in this country. Their protests have caused people to sit up and take a view, and some people have been put off by it, and quite a large number of people have been forced to think about it. And if you're not going to engage in that sort of protest, you've got to work out what else you're going to do, because doing nothing isn't an option. And therefore, I think the controversy is part of the way in which the agenda is raised for people. And we might not like the way this gets raised by some groups, but there we are. I think Greta Thunberg, who I did find quite difficult, and I find irritating, because she seems to think that those of us who are older have just been doing nothing all our lives, whereas I think this has been quite a main theme for some of us for all our lives. And so I'm myself resentful of the way in which she talks down to me. Actually, she's absolutely right. We haven't done enough. We're giving our kids and grandchildren an incredibly difficult agenda. So how we hear one another in this debate, and how we use controversy and this sort of really difficult stuff, is critical to us being able to travel together. And we've got to learn to do that. And some of us have responsibilities for public policy, and some of us have technical and scientific responsibilities, and some of us have a sort of critical and protesting sort of responsibility. And I think the task, particularly for the church, is to work out how to hold that together so that we are capable of traveling together, because we do live in this common home. That's Pope Francis's great perception, I think, in Laudato Si', that this is our common home. And he's writing not just for Roman Catholics, not just for Christians, not just for people of faith or goodwill, but he's writing for everybody, because we've got to learn to live in this our common home, which takes me back to your point about the lay community, this ecumenical community where we belong together in this one house. That's critical to the whole thing, and churches can help in that process. Not always, but they can help, and we have some experience.
Thank you.
I'm going to bring in Chris Dobson, who in fact was the person who first suggested that we adopt Sleepers Wake as our Advent book.
Thank you.
So, Chris.
Hi, Nick. Can I first of all admit that I've got a daughter and son-in-law who are vegan, and I love going round to theirs, and their food is very imaginative and always delicious. And I don't know if it was Christmas Day one year when a turnip was produced instead of a turkey, and decorated in a beautiful way in the middle of the dish. But they were thoroughly nourishing and delicious. Thank you for reminding us what Pope Francis said about the importance of contemplation and prayer in respect of climate change to help us interiorly, but also other people to change their opinion on climate matters. And you've illustrated in your wonderful book how meditating on paintings is very important, and you gave us some examples. We have a small meditation group that meets morning and evening before our evening and morning prayer, and I was just wondering whether you've got a favorite painting that you like to meditate on, or whether you could point to 2 or 3 that we could use during our periods of meditation. We could actually have it on the screen instead of our candle.
At various stages in my life, I've found each of the 4 Gospels, one of them more attractive than the others. So I think when I was younger, Mark worked best, and it was short and urgent and energetic and all of that. Nowadays, I haven't got any doubts that it's John's Gospel that feeds me and nourishes me. And I think my response to your question is similar, really, that there isn't one painting, but of course there are lots. And you sort of need to find the ones that work for you and connect with your biography, because most of us aren't art historians and haven't got this vast store of things. So I put some of my favourite paintings in the book, and I've owned up that the Richter tapestry, which I think isn't on display at St Martin Fields at the moment, but it has been in the Dick Shepherd Chapel, is, I think, one of the most beautiful objects that I've known. And it was a privilege to discover in a Soho loft, and then for the person who was who owned it, I think, really, gave it on permanent loan. So those sorts of things, sometimes a bit happenstance. I've got on my desk 3 stones, which are sort of special to me because they help me to meditate, from Sinai, from the Judean desert, and from the Sea of Galilee. Very different sorts of. And I think you've just got to find those sorts of things. Mother Julian's hazelnut, right? So if you want a favourite painting, and it seems a bit unfair not to answer that, then I think I'd say Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus. But I don't know that that's going to help you very much with the environmental stuff, except it does help you with the presence of Christ and our engagement with it, the way we stand, as it were, by the table looking into the painting. So I think I'm going to duck your question in terms of what specifically for the environment. But there are plenty of wonderful nature paintings, if that's what you want, or plenty of paintings that will get you into the scriptures in such a way that they will help you find your place. And actually, the Salisbury Cathedral contemporary works of art interpret the building in the most wonderful way. But they weren't designed to do it. They weren't sequential. The Frink statue came first, then the Gabriel Loire East window, and then the Bill Pye font over about a 30 plus year period. But they sort of would read better the other way around nowadays. I think that's not a terribly helpful answer, but I think it's an honest one.
Thank you very much indeed.
Can I just interject on that same subject, that when people are contributing to the Lenten calendar, we're asking them if they can think of one to contribute an image as well. And so maybe by the end of Lent, we'll have 40 images and people will be able to choose from some of them.
Great. That's really good to know.
Gerard. Gerard,
Yeah, I quite like my puddings. Everybody knows what I'm going to answer. What's your favourite ice cream?
What's my favourite ice cream?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, I don't know. I'm not terribly keen on ice cream at this stage of my life, I think. Probably a Magnum or something like that.
Okay. Thanks anyway.
And why did you ask?
Because I always ask every time I go into a talk. I always ask everybody.
Thank you, Gerard. And Claire and Charles again.
So trying to unmute.
Yes, you've done it.
Very good. Just on the point of pictures to look at, I don't know if everyone's aware of this or not, but there is some, I'm not sure how you get onto it, but there's an organisation called Christian Art that sends us each day an email with today's gospel in it and an associated work of art related to the gospel, and a sort of commentary on it by Patrick van der Vorst. So that's something I'd recommend if you'd like to have that sort of thing.
Thank you. There are a few organisations that have done a lot to encourage the connection of art and Christianity in our sort of generation, which have become a bit detached. And there was an Anglican priest called Tom Devonshire Jones who set up Art and Christianity, and that's taken off really. And I'm not sure whether that's the organisation that you're talking about. I wasn't aware of them doing an email that you've just described, so I think it's probably different. But I think there are a few organisations like that that really help in terms of encouraging contemporary art in connection with places of worship.
And I was just that there is a mindfulness group in the lay community, and this last Thursday we were doing some slow looking. So we were using sort of objects found in the people's rooms for this, but we also do a lot of focus on nature within mindfulness, and this really tuning into the sense perception of the environment, because as Thich Nhat Hanh said, you know, to get people to be concerned about the earth, first of all, you have to love it. And in order to love it, you have to be able to experience it. And I think tuning into the five senses is one of those ways. So we were tuning into, well, both touch and looking really on Thursday. But I just wanted to mention that this is perhaps a way in for some people who find perhaps the complexities of Christian theology difficult, but you know, having a direct experience of nature can be a really powerful way in.
Thank you very much for that. That is like Pope Francis, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're going to be drawing to a close fairly soon. I just wanted to pick up on what you said a few minutes ago, Bishop Nick, about the role of the church in holding together society in the inevitably controversial debates that must occur if we're going to see the changes that are required. And I wondered if you might bring this to a close by perhaps saying a little bit more about what that might look like.
Well, I don't think it's just the perception of a Church of England bishop. I think that churches are pretty good at holding together in common purpose. I mean, actually, the Roman Catholic sort of teaching documents would generally work with people of goodwill, good faith, and not just people who are Roman Catholic or Christians. And Laudato Si goes even further than that. So I think what we need to be doing in this is finding a way of talking about creation in such a way as to engage common purpose and shared understanding and shared action. And I'm interested in the way in which this conversation is capable of happening across other faith groups. I've worked quite a bit with a number of rabbis. a little bit with Muslims, and I mean, Buddhists are pretty easy territory for this sort of thing, and Hindus too. There's a way in which we can work together across the faiths, and I think people of no faiths. In Dorset and Wiltshire, there were quite large numbers of pagans still sort of written into the landscape of that ancient settled part of the world. And of course, they had a care for creation. They understood what this was about, and they were deeply appreciative of the way in which the churches were engaged with this. And this was an area where we could work together. And I think these are the things where we can do things. And because of our involvement in schools and education, then we can work across the generations as well. So I think they're the immediate things. Of course, the most obvious thing about the churches is it's a global community we're local everywhere. And we've got networks. Most churches have got links with churches in other parts of the world. The Diocese of Salisbury with the church in the Sudan and South Sudan. But that's typical of every church, not just the Church of England. And therefore we can see this through our brothers and sisters' eyes. We can learn from their experience. And that seems to me a real gift in terms of the way that we can act, because there are very few organisations which are that internationally connected in communion.
Yes, and I completely concur with that. And in the Diocese of Exeter, where we are, there is a connection with the Church in Melanesia, and that is a part of the world where people are already experiencing the rises in sea level, which are threatening villages and communities.
Yes.
Well, take one last contribution from Kate and Tim, and Kate and Tim Livesey, and then it'll be over to Adam to bring things to a conclusion. So, Katie.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. I just wanted to say that the chapter in Sleepers Wake that really moved me the most was that collection of letters from different churches. So as you were talking just now, I thought that I really had to mention that. I found that chapter really deeply moving, and it is in that exercise of listening to other people who have a different experience of the world that we're going to learn. So that was, it's not really a question, it was just, recommending that chapter to everybody, to read again and to revisit, because it is a very striking and vivid chapter. And thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much. I don't need to say any more, do I?
Thank you, Katie. Okay, Adam, over to you.
So thank you very much, Peter and Catherine. So just to end off, first of all, I'd like to say a big thanks to Peter and Catherine for what they've done with our Caring for Creation group. Because when COP26 was coming up and taking place, it was evident that many members of the community were very, very engaged in this. We had scientists who were presenting at COP26 who are members of the community. We had people standing on the fringes who were demonstrating, and we were praying very much as a community for a positive outcome to it. So afterwards, when I put out a request to say, would anyone like to take this forward? Peter and Catherine came forward. And I have to say that in the last 15, 16 months, they've done so much to help us to raise our awareness and to be that sort of conscience and reminding us and doing things. So thank you very much, Peter and Catherine. And I think that we're just really at the beginning of our journey, and that we have a lot more to do. So I have just a thought, which is that I've come back I was away abroad, and I'm afraid that my carbon footprint is not one to be proud of, because I was in San Diego. We went to the Anza Borrego Desert, and the flowers bloomed in the Anza Borrego Desert for the first time in 4 years. And the seeds lie underground for 15 years. And they wait for the perfect combination of rain and cold and heat. And then occasionally the desert blooms. And so I just would like to thank Bishop Nick for sowing the seeds into our hearts, and into the hearts of so many people with your book and with all the work that you've done, and being an old person or older person, not just Greta Thunberg, but also everyone else, but giving us that inspiration, those seeds, which we as Christians have to believe will bloom, and that we will see goodness prevail, and we will see common sense prevail, and that, you know, the writing is on the wall, but, you know, that we do have that faith. So even though it's jolly hard to believe it with all of the scientific evidence. But so thank you very much on behalf of all of the lay community, Bishop Nick. It's been an absolute delight to hear from you, and you brought it to life so much. Even if we had read the book beforehand, you brought it to life and made it very, very special time for us. So thank you very much from all of us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Right. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Bishop Nick. And thank you, everybody, for being here tonight and listening and taking part in this event. And we wish you good night and a pleasant evening.